Hey guys, so today in this video we're going to be looking at the muscular system. Now again, as with this system and any other of the physiological systems, we first want to take a look at some of the basic structures and functions of this system. So looking at the muscular system, what functions does the muscular system provide for us? Well, one, we know that it attaches to the skeleton and then contracts to help produce that movement. Right? So we know that the muscular system is responsible for movement. Well, we also know that when muscles move, they actually will produce a lot of energy, which then produces heat. So muscles are also responsible for helping to produce heat for our body. Then, of course, a given is with keeping us moving, it's also meant to keep our skeleton upright, because as we know, our skeleton itself would not be standing as it is. Our bones don't perfectly Jenga stack together and hold themselves together without the support of those muscles. So with that in mind, what exactly is posture? Well, posture is being situated over a base of support. It is the position of our body over a base of support. So posture can come in many forms. Posture can come because my base of support is my feet and I'm standing here in this pose. It could be if I'm sitting on my butt and my body is positioned in that manner. Or I could be on my head and my base of support is my head and my body is positioned in such a manner. Now, as we maintain this posture, our muscles need to have a certain tension to them or integrity to them. We call this tonus. Tonus is the present tone or tension that is just normally there in a muscle that helps us to maintain position as we are static. Now, when we look at the muscles, we're going to break down a muscle and build it up from its most basic structure. Now, as we learn that all tissues, muscle tissue being one of them, all tissues are made up of cells. So muscle tissue made up of muscle cells, or what we call muscle fibers, is going to get broken down. So a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. So what exactly do we look at when we're talking about a muscle cell? Well, a muscle cell is very similar to a regular cell in the body. So if you remember back from the massage basics there, the introduction to anatomy, we looked at the structures of a cell. We saw a cell was like a living person. It had a skin, it had all these little structures to it. So the first thing we're looking at is some of the components of a muscle cell. So we have what we call a sarcolemma. Now let's break that down. Sarco is a word meaning flesh. So anytime we see sarco, we're going to think muscle. So sarco is a word that we're going to see often repeated in the muscular lecture here. So the sarcolemma is basically the cell membrane of the muscle fiber. Then, of course, we have the sarcoplasm, which is the plasma which is inside the muscle cell. So very similar to the cytoplasm of a regular cell. Now, it's going to get a little confusing. We're going to literally take the most basic unit of this muscle cell and build a muscle all the way up. So the first thing we're looking at is what we call the protein filaments. The protein filaments that we find in the muscle are actin and myosin. The two major protein filaments we've seen are actin and myosin. Now, we need to remember which one is thick and which one is thin. That's going to be rather important to us. So I like to have this idea in mind. Act thin is the thin one. Act thin is the thin filament. Myosin, myo actually meaning muscle, so myosin being like thinking a big strong muscle, myosin is the thick filament. So actin is the thin filament and myosin is the thick filament. Now, actin and myosin are used, and we find them in what we call a sarcomere. The sarcomere is the basic unit of contraction. It is the functional unit of the muscular system that we see. So that one single sarcomere, which has certain characteristics, we see is composed of actin and myosin. And it's measured from what we call Z line to Z line. So ziggly, squiggly Z lines, which are the actin, and then in the center of the sarcomere is what we call the H zone or the heavy zone. So the Z line has the actin, the thin filaments, and the H zone, or the heavy zone as I like to call it, has the thick myosin. So the thick myosin pulls on the actin and brings the Z lines together towards that H zone, which we'll see here in a second. So the main regions of a sarcomere, the sarcomere being the functional unit of the muscular system, are the Z lines, the two outside edges, the Z lines. Then on the very center is the H zone, and we need to know that the Z lines are pulled to the H zone to make the sarcomere shorter. So when we take sarcomeres, we can take sarcomeres and place them together. So we'd have a sarcomere and a sarcomere and a sarcomere and a sarcomere all the way through the entire length of the muscle fiber. So we take these sarcomeres and we band them together into what we call a myofibril. So a myofibril is a chain of sarcomeres. This chain of sarcomeres will run the length of a muscle fiber. A muscle fiber runs the entire length of the muscle itself, from origin to insertion, basically the musculotendinous attachments. Now, we'll take a myofibril and we'll group them up together with multiple myofibrils. And so multiple myofibrils come together to form a muscle fiber. So that muscle fiber is that individual muscle cell. So before we even got to the muscle cell, we started with the protein filaments, the actin and myosin, the thin and thick filament respectively. We took those protein filaments together and formed a sarcomere, which was the basic unit of contraction, measured from Z line to Z line and is pulled to the middle or H zone. Then we took sarcomeres and lined them up together into a long chain to make a myofibril. Now we've taken those myofibrils, we've taken many myofibrils and put them together and bundled them together and wrapped them up and bound them into a muscle cell or a muscle fiber. So now we are going to take a bunch of muscle fibers and group them together into a functional, nice little package and make what we call a fasciculi. So a fasciculi is a group of muscle fibers and muscle cells. And then we can take groups of fasciculi, which are bundles of muscle fibers, together and then wrap those up, and that makes what we call a muscle. So it's sort of this little Russian nesting doll of structure that makes up an entire muscle. So as we looked, we saw this basic structuring of the muscle here. So we have a muscle fiber, muscle cell, which gets grouped up with a bunch of other muscle fibers to make a fasciculi. Then we group up a bunch of fasciculi together to make a muscle. Well, we have a connective tissue covering on each individual one of those parts, which, remember, is that extension of the superficial fascia. So that connective tissue layer on top of the muscle then permeates through each and individual muscle and is technically just a continuation. So all these names that we're going to give are just a continuation of that connective tissue. So each individual muscle fiber is covered by connective tissue. We call it the endomysium. Endo meaning within or innermost. Endomysium, myo, muscle, sium, and since we're covering it with this connective tissue. So the endomysium is the connective tissue covering of the individual muscle fiber. So then we said we grouped up those muscle fibers together and then we'll bound and wind those up together to make a fasciculi. So the fasciculi is covered by what we call the perimysium. The perimysium, meaning the peri surrounding a bunch of muscle fibers, is the connective tissue covering that makes up and binds or separates the fasciculi. So when those fasciculi come together and we wrap up the fasciculi into one big nice bundled package, we have what we call the epimysium. Epi meaning on top of. So this is the connective tissue that is on top of the entire muscle itself. So like we said, the individual muscle fiber is bound up, is covered by the endomysium, the innermost layer. The fasciculi is covered by the perimysium, or surrounding a bunch of muscle fibers. And then we have the epimysium, which covers the entire thing. It's on the whole shebang. So this connective tissue, as we saw, that's covering each individual muscle fiber, covering each fasciculi, and covering the muscle itself, we can think of it like a piece of candy, right? So let's think of a Tootsie Roll. So we have the Tootsie Roll, the log of Tootsie, whatever it is, Tootsie in there, wrapped up by a little wrapper. And then on the ends, we twist it off, and so we have this little extension. So if we imagine that the wrapper of the Tootsie Roll is the connective tissue covering, and the Tootsie itself, the candy inside, is the muscle, we know that there's an extension of this wrapping coming off of it. So being in the same example, the wrapper of the candy would be the epimysium. And so the extension of the wrapper, which would then bridge this muscle to these bones, is the tendon. So the tendons of our muscles are actually the continuation of the connective tissue covering on all of the different parts of the muscle. So then the tendons will anchor the muscle to the bone. So the muscle fibers meet the tendon at what we call the musculo-tendinous junction. This is the junction where two things meet. This is where things meet. This is where the muscles and the tendon meet, the musculo-tendinous junction. So when it comes to these tendons, there's a few forms of tendons we can see. One is an aponeurosis. We've seen this before in a few other of the lectures in the massage basics. An aponeurosis is a thin sheet of connective tissue that connects multiple muscles together. So a thin sheet of connective tissue will usually connect multiple different muscles together, such as the epicranial aponeurosis or the thoracolumbar aponeurosis in the low back. It's just a junction where many muscles come together. We would also have a retinaculum. A retinaculum is a thin band of connective tissue that usually holds tendons of muscles down. So a retinaculum would be like right here in the wrist, holding down the tendons of my forearm flexors and extensors. Now in the very center of the muscle would be what we call the belly. So the belly of the muscle is the very big center, which is usually where that full contraction, comes together. So in the belly of the muscle, that muscle comes together for that full contraction. When we look at the different parts of a muscle, we saw that we had the tendon coming from A to B. Well, we would have what we call origin and insertion. Now, origin is where the muscle comes from. It's where it originates at. The insertion is where it comes down to. So the origin is usually established at the more fixed bone. It's on the more stable end. And then the insertion is located at the more movable parts of the body. So for instance, if I were to say I had my biceps muscle, my biceps brachii muscle, well, I'm attaching to the shoulder because it's more stable, and then I'm crossing, I'm attached to the scapula because it's more stable, and then I'm crossing the elbow, which is a lot more movable, right? So the origin would be the shoulder blade, parts of the shoulder blade, and then the insertion would be on the forearm. We're just going to keep it basic there. Now, when the muscles contract, they generally cause insertion to move towards the origin. So the insertion usually moves towards the origin. Now, some muscles have the ability to fix the ends of themselves. So, for instance, if we were to lock our shoulders in place and contract our trapezius muscle, well, we would have head movement. As opposed to if we locked our head in place and moved our trapezius muscle, we would have shoulder shrugs. Now, when we change which side of the muscle is moving and which origin is moving, if origin is moving to insertion or insertion is moving to origin, we call that functional reversibility. So functional reversibility is the ability of a muscle to pull its origin to the insertion. instead of insertion typically moving towards the origin. Now these muscles are contracting based off of a property called the sliding filament theory or sliding filament model, which is the proposed theory that we were just looking at in the sarcomeres, that the Z lines are pulled towards the H zone. And so these sarcomeres are contracting, these Z lines are moving to the H zone in every single sarcomere along the entire length of the myofibril. So essentially these sarcomeres are kind of accordioning together to shorten the length of the muscle fiber, which creates that muscular contraction. Now, when it comes to muscular contraction, we see a few major components. One, muscles won't contract without say-so from the nervous system. So first, the nervous system has to come out and talk to each individual muscle fiber. Now, the muscle fiber is spoken to by the nerves at what we call the neuromuscular junction. Again, we see another junction. Junction is where things come together. So this is where the nervous system, neuromuscular system come together. So the neuromuscular junction is where the nervous system reaches out and talks to the individual muscle fibers, which is made up of the nervous system, the individual neuron coming out with what we call a synaptic bulb, reaching out to little folds in the muscle sarcolemma, the skin of the muscle, which we call the motor end plate. And then there's a little gap in between that bulb and the end plate. And then neurotransmitters are passed in between that gap, which then bind to receptors in the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber, which then cause contraction. That chiefly responsible neurotransmitter is what we call acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, however you want to pronounce it, is the chief neurotransmitter responsible for facilitating muscular contraction. Now, when it comes to the nervous system meeting parts of the muscles, we can kind of group up the muscles being innervated or spoken to by the nervous system into units. So we have what we call motor units. And then when we have motor units, we can recruit them, or what we would call motor recruitment, which comes into play by us learning, one, gravity, learning weight, and two, learning the amount of force necessary to work in that environment, working in gravity, working with weight, right? Because we all know that it takes a lot less muscular effort to lift this pen than it would to lift a 30-pound weight. So if I were to recruit the same amount of muscle fibers and muscle and musculature to lift this pen as I would to lift a 30-pound weight, I would pinch this pen and then sling it probably, because I'm using too much effort. So motor recruitment boils down to how much effort you put in an effort to lift an object. So obviously lifting heavier objects requires more motor units to be recruited, while lifting lighter objects requires less motor units to be recruited. And when it comes to this motor unit recruitment, we're going to recruit these muscles. These muscles will contract to their fullest ability, or they won't contract at all. We call this the all or none law, or the all or none response. So the all or none law, or all or none response, which also goes along with the nervous system, is that the muscle is going to contract to its fullest ability, or it won't do so at all. So we looked at the chief neurotransmitter responsible for facilitating muscle contraction. Let's look at the molecular structure responsible for actually producing the energy for muscle contraction. And that would be the adenosine triphosphate, the ATP. The adenosine triphosphate molecule, with one adenosine molecule and three phosphate molecules, the phosphate molecule will bind to a receptor site, and then it breaks its bond. When it breaks that bond, it produces a high amount of energy, which will also produce heat, which is why our muscles will generate heat when we move them, then creates what we call ADP, adenosine diphosphate, which will then further go to recuperate its missing phosphate molecule to be remade again. So remember, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the basic unit, the molecular structure or energy for the muscle cell. Basic unit of energy for any cell, the basic molecular structure for energy in any cell, which, as we remember from the basics of anatomy, the intro to anatomy, is produced by, ATP is produced by the mitochondria of these cells. So we know that muscle cells, muscle fibers, have a lot of mitochondria because we need to produce a lot of energy to make these muscles move, and we might as well produce it at the source. Now, when it comes to muscles, we have types of muscle fibers. So we have all these muscle cells, so muscle cells can have a specialized purpose. So muscle cells and muscle fibers can be broken into type 1 or type 2. Type 1 muscle fibers are what we call slow twitch muscle fibers. Slow twitch because they're slow to react and they usually maintain their contraction for a long time. We also call these red muscle fibers because of the fact that they have a high presence of myoglobin, which is very similar to hemoglobin and in a red blood cell, and that helps to store oxygen. So oxygen is very responsible for helping muscle contractions over a long period of time. So they need a high amount of oxygen to maintain this contraction. So now every single muscle is going to have an amount of type 1 and type 2, but that amount is going to vary. So muscles that we consider postural, or muscles that help keep us and maintain our posture, help keep us upright, have high amounts of type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. So our rectus spinae muscles and muscles of our quads have a lot of type 1 muscle fibers. On the flip side is type 2, or what we call fast twitch muscle fibers. And these would be phasic muscle fibers, phasic meaning movement. So fast twitch muscle fibers are what we call white fibers. They don't have as high amount of myoglobin as the type 1 do. So they're meant to just do their action and then stop. So they're literally just the quick actors. They act fast to do micro, fast, quick movements of the body, and then they retire and then have to recoup. So typically our smaller muscles are like such as our rotator cuff muscles are usually more phasic. They usually have higher amounts of type 2 muscle fibers and just help with minute movements and then retire after a long period of time. So they're not responsible for maintaining contraction and keeping us in position as some other muscles might be. So as we're talking about these muscle fibers and which way that they're able to contract or all of this contraction, well, let's look at how muscles or types of contractions muscles can perform, especially in relation to massage therapy output and work. So when it comes to muscle contraction, we can have two forms in relation to massage therapy. We can have passive contraction or active contraction. Passive contraction is where other forces, aka the massage therapist, will place the client's muscle into a contracted state. It doesn't require effort on the client's part in order to make that muscle lengthen or shorten. Now, active is going to be the complete opposite. Active is obviously going to require action on the client's part. They're going to have to physically contract that muscle. So when it comes to active movements, well, we know that muscles can either lengthen or shorten. So we can have two types of movements in an active state. We can have an isotonic contraction, or we can then have an isometric contraction. So isotonic contractions is where the muscle contracts and the length of the muscle can change. And this gives us two types or two different types of contractions. So there's two phases in an isotonic contraction. We can have a shortening phase or a contraction phase, which is called the concentric phase. So the concentric phase of movement is the contraction. Then the muscle can lengthen out. So if we're looking at solely the biceps muscle here, this is the concentric phase, and then we would have the elongation phase, or what we call the eccentric phase. Now, an isometric action is another type of active action, but isometric actions or isometric contractions occur when the muscle is contracted, but the length of the muscle does not change. So for instance, if I were to start this bicep curl and then stopped this muscle from getting any shorter, but it's still contracting, then we're in an isometric phase, which massage therapists can use this to their advantage and use this in their therapy. So with massage therapists, we can have what we call active assisted or active resisted techniques. So active assisted techniques would go along with the isotonic contractions. So for instance, if I'm doing a biceps curl, then I would come in as a massage therapist and then push the hand and help to further that movement, or vice versa in the elongation phase. If I'm going to do active resisted techniques, it would be an isometric action. So an active resisted, I could have the therapist or have the client contract that muscle and then resist it. Now, of course, with active resisted, I don't have to resist it fully to the point where there's no movement occurring. I can let some movement occur, and that's up to the benefit or up to the type of work I'm trying to do and the type of thing I'm trying to achieve, the type of goal I'm trying to achieve. So muscles can be classified, again, just like bones were, in their shapes. So when it comes to muscle shapes, we look at the muscle shapes based off of their fiber direction. So one of them is what we call parallel or fusiform. So parallel or fusiform muscles are muscles where their fiber directions run in a straight line. So very, very uniform fiber direction, very neat fiber direction. So such as the rectus abdominis, the abs, the fiber directions run straight up and down in a nice parallel manner. We could then have what we call convergent muscles. So quite the opposite of parallel. Their muscle fibers converge to a finite point. So they start broad like a fan and then come in and hone into a point, such as the pectoralis major muscle. We could then have spiral muscles. Spiral muscles curve around the body and follow contours of the body, such as the latissimus dorsi. We could then have circular rings of muscle. Circular rings of muscle, also known as sphincters, such as the muscular ring around your mouth or the muscular ring around your eye, which causes you to do this like you ate something really sour. And then lastly, the type of muscle fibers we could have is pennate. Pennate, like penne pasta, kind of has that little angular cut to it, right? So pennate muscles have that little angle to it. Now, pennate muscles can be broken down into unipennate, bipennate, or multipennate. Unipennate, look at like a feather, right? We know that there's a central tendon, there's a center part of the feather, and then the little fluffs come off to the side. Well, if we cut that feather in half and just only had that really solid center of it, the bulk of it, or like a leaf if we had the solid stem, and the feathers branching off to the side on one side, that would be like a unipennate muscle. Bipennate would be the whole feather itself. An example of a bipennate muscle is the rectus femoris of the quadriceps group. So associate that heavily with this example. The rectus femoris is an example of a bipennate muscle. Multipennate muscles stem from multiple central tendons and then have their fibers span out, which would be an example of like the deltoids muscle group there. We can also classify muscles by how many joints they cross as well. So if a joint only crosses if a muscle only crosses one joint, then we call it uniarticular. If it crosses two joints, we call it biarticular. If it crosses more than two joints, we call it multi-articular. So a uniarticular joint would be like the brachialis muscle in the arm. So it only crosses the elbow and only flexes the elbow. Then if we had the biceps brachii, well, that crosses at the shoulder and it crosses at the elbow to cause flexion and extension. Now, technically, it actually operates on other joints, so we could consider it a multi-articular joint, but we'll just keep that simple and say, well, it flexes and extends the arm and flexes flexes the shoulder and flexes the elbow there. It doesn't do any extensions, forget that. But a good example of a multi-articular joint would be like the erector spinae group, which run from the head all the way down to the low back, which then every single one of these vertebrae has lots of joints and they're going to act on those. So it operates on multiple joints at one time. So let's go ahead and look at a few roles that these muscles play. So muscles will have this, it's almost like a cast of a set, right? We're having a play. So in this cast, we would have what we call the protagonist. The protagonist is the star of the show. Well, in this case of muscle movement and muscle play, we have what we call the prime mover. Prime mover is the muscle responsible for doing the main action. So the prime mover is the star of the show. Then, of course, if we had this protagonist in a movie, we would have then people who helped him. So let's say we're watching the, Marvel universe. So we have Superman, and then Superman has all of his friends. We would call them synergists. So the prime mover has synergists. Synergists assist the prime mover in their function. While they're not doing the main action there, they're not the one responsible for doing most of the force, they're helping with the movement in some way. So then we would have fixators. Fixators, in the case of the muscles, would help stabilize the joint in which is moving. So for instance, again, this Marvel movie, Superman being the prime mover, the entire Justice League being the synergist, well, you could say that the local law enforcement are kind of the fixators. They help manage the smaller things going on. Then, of course, with every superhero movie, it's not complete without some sort of adversity. So then we would have an antagonist. We would have the enemy. So same thing here with muscles. A muscle is going to move in one direction, but it's going to have a counter opposite muscle to move it the opposite way or oppose that action. So we have an antagonistic muscle. So for instance, the biceps brachii, the biceps muscle, is antagonized by the triceps muscle on the complete opposite side. So they work together to help this interplay of movement. So the bicep muscle causes this contraction, while the tricep muscle opposes that action and can help to manage at how fast this muscle is contracting. So with this said, we're going to look at a strange phenomenon. We call this reciprocal inhibition or autogenic inhibition, which is that when a muscle receives a stimulus to contract, its antagonistic muscle has to receive a signal to relax. This is what we call Sherrington's law. So basically, if I was to try to contract my bicep muscle and my tricep muscle was trying to contract too, they would be in a stalemate and I wouldn't go anywhere. So in order to contract my bicep muscle, my bicep muscle needs to get a signal to say, hey, shorten. And then my tricep muscle needs to get a signal to say, hey, you need to relax and let the bicep do its thing. So Sherrington's law, or reciprocal inhibition. Now let's go ahead and look at some pathological conditions in relation to muscles. So the first muscle and tendon related issue is de Quervain's tenosynovitis. De Quervain's tenosynovitis is a condition found in the thumb, around the thumb side, and this is inflammation of the synovial sheath on the tendon around the thumb, which causes a lot of pain around the thumb. So very common for an overuse injury, especially for massage therapists. So some of the best methods of correction here for de Quervain's tenosynovitis is to just let it heal since it's an overuse injury. Then massage can come in to help with other conditions or help with other symptoms and pain management. We would then have fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is a very interesting condition. We have very little idea what causes this, and then often, most times in my opinion, it's probably induced by a lot of stress in the body. Well, fibromyalgia is a condition where it's characterized by widespread pain in the body, found by in either the muscle or the fibers of the or connective tissue fibers. So there's no real clear-cut example of what's going on here, of what's causing this. But massage can be and has proven to be very beneficial for fibromyalgia because of, one, the stress reduction that is associated with massage therapy. Also, it can help to deregulate the neurological response to those muscle fibers and connective tissues that might be causing that pain and irritation. So we could help retard the stimulation to those painful areas of the body caused by fibromyalgia. So the other condition, which is somewhat similar to fibromyalgia but usually has a root cause, is myofascial pain syndrome. So myofascial pain syndrome is an overuse injury, usually common with people who overwork muscles and the muscles are now sore and fatigued. And massage can greatly help with that in helping to relieve the pain and remove any dysfunction. The next condition we're looking at is Osgood-Schlater's disease, which is a condition of the irritation of the common quadriceps tendon because of an excess growth of the tibial tuberosity on the knee. Massage can help with pain management, but not be corrective in any sense of the help of correction there. The next condition we're looking at is plantar fasciitis. Plantar fasciitis is inflammation of the connective tissue on the bottom of the foot, or the plantar side of the foot. So this plantar fascia becomes inflamed for several reasons and can be greatly helped with massage therapy depending on the onset. Now with that, I would say, and we'll probably have a whole video on treating plantar fasciitis, how I like to use cups on treating plantar fasciitis. But one thing to keep in mind is work yourself out of the mentality that you need to be solely on the bottom of the foot. Work those calf muscles and you'll see a great level of improvement to the treatment of this condition with massage therapy. Our next condition is what we call shin splints. Shin splints are micro tearings of the muscles of the shin, such as the tibialis muscles. This is an overuse injury, which then, of course, the best method of treatment is to just let it heal on its own, and then massage therapy can come in to help further that. So the next condition we're looking at is a strain. Remember, strains are to muscles and tendons, and sprains are injuries to ligaments. Now remember that they can come in 3 different grades, and then the process of treatment revolves around the severity of the injury. Then we have other general terms of conditions such as tendinitis or tenosynovitis or tendinopathy, just general terms that relate to inflammation or some sort of condition affecting a tendon there. We can also have tension headaches. Tension headaches occur from tight or overtoned muscles, or even trigger points in muscles that connect in and around the head, which then cause that tension, which then leads to referred pain sensations felt in the head, which mimic those headache symptoms. So those trigger points can be easily worked out. We'll look at trigger points later on. Trigger points can be worked out, which then can relieve the pain and relieve the headache. Another condition would be torticollis. Torticollis is a condition where the SCM, the sternocleidomastoid, contracts and causes the head to be in a turned position, such as this. Torticollis can occur and is pretty common to occur in children. For what reason, I am unsure. But torticollis can be a condition where an overuse injury or a whiplash injury, automotive injury. I know I developed it after an automotive injury. So the onset could be direct trauma. It could be, a slew of other things. Now with the automotive injury side, we can look at what's called whiplash. Whiplash is the sudden jerking, rocking motion that causes tearing in muscles. So whiplash occurs, like we all know, from that hard impact of an automobile accident. Now, of course, whiplash can occur from any other types of impact where the head suddenly moves and the muscles have to immediately react and cause this contraction, and then receive a tear or some sort of injury. So understanding whiplash is very intrinsic to how the accident happened. So for instance, if someone if you rear-ended someone, well, your body is going forward, which then means that the muscles on the back of your neck and back of your body have to try to pull to stop your head from flying forward. So the back muscles could be injured. If someone rear-ended you, well, your head's going this way, so the muscles on the front of the body, front of the chain of the body, are injured. If someone T-bones you on the driver's side, you're going this way. Some muscles on the lateral, the right side chain of your body could be injured, or vice versa if you were T-boned on the passenger side. So, well, guys, that's going to do it for the muscular system. Go ahead, make sure you take your notes, study up, and if you have any questions, let me know. I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.